You are a janitor, not a strategist. Stay in your lane, son.
The map does not care what you call me, only whether you understand it.
Get him out of here, now. The command cracked through the cold, recycled air of the war room, sharp enough to cut through the low hum of servers and the soft glow of a 40-foot digital map stretching across the wall. 2 security officers moved in without hesitation, their boots striking the polished floor in perfect rhythm as they grabbed the arm of an old man in a faded janitor's uniform, his gray shirt slightly wrinkled, a mop cart left abandoned near the doorway. Around them, rows of officers in pressed uniforms and tailored suits turned, their conversations dying mid-sentence as attention snapped toward the disruption. At the center of it all stood General Robert Hale, a 4-star commander with decades etched into the lines of his face, his posture rigid as he oversaw the classified briefing. Satellite feeds flickered across the massive display, terrain grids, heat signatures, predictive movement patterns, all orchestrated by a system that cost more than most people would earn in a lifetime. And yet, the old man didn't look at the soldiers, or the officers, or even the general. His pale eyes stayed fixed on the map. "Sir," he refused to leave, one of the security officers said, tightening his grip slightly, though the old man offered no resistance. "He claims the projection is wrong." A faint ripple of amusement passed through the room. Captain Ryan Cole stepped forward, his uniform immaculate, his confidence unmistakable. He glanced at the janitor, then back at the glowing map. "This is a top-secret operation," he said, his tone clipped, controlled. "You don't even have clearance to be on this floor." A few quiet chuckles followed. Someone near the back shook their head. The old man finally shifted his gaze, not to Cole, but to a narrow corridor of terrain on the screen, an unremarkable stretch of desert, marked in pale red. "You're sending them straight into it," he said. His voice was low, steady, almost lost beneath the quiet hum of electronics. The room paused, not out of respect, but confusion. Cole let out a short laugh, folding his arms. "Into what, exactly?" The old man didn't answer right away. His eyes traced invisible lines across the map, as if following something no one else could see. "They're already dead," he said quietly. "They just don't know it yet." The words landed heavier than they should have. For a brief second, the room went still. Then the tension cracked. A few officers exchanged glances. One of them smirked. Cole shook his head, stepping closer. "This isn't some old field exercise," he said, his voice sharpening. "We have real-time satellite data, predictive analytics, AI modeling, everything is accounted for." The old man didn't react. Not to the tone. Not to the dismissal. He simply looked back at the map. "Not everything," he said. Somewhere near the edge of the room, Emily Carter, a young intelligence analyst, stopped typing. Her eyes flickered between the screen and the old man. Something about the way he said it wasn't guesswork. It wasn't confusion. It was certainty. And that was the part that didn't make sense. Captain Cole's smirk lingered just long enough to invite agreement from the room, and a few heads nodded as if the matter had already been settled, but Emily Carter did not look away from the map, her fingers hovering above her keyboard, the faint glow of the display reflecting in her eyes as she replayed the old man's words in her mind, not the tone but the certainty behind them, the kind of certainty that did not belong in guesses or assumptions, it belonged in experience, and experience did not come from nowhere, sir, she said carefully, her voice cutting in just enough to interrupt the drift back to normal, the projection corridor. "Can we recheck the movement pattern along grid Echo 7? Cole did not even turn fully toward her, his attention still fixed on the janitor as if he were a minor inconvenience that had overstayed its welcome. "It has already been verified," he replied, his tone dismissive, multiple times, but Emily was already typing, her screen pulling up layers of data beneath the main display, wind patterns, elevation shifts, temperature gradients, variables that were technically accounted for but rarely questioned once the system had finalized its output, and for a moment nothing changed, the map remained clean, precise, confident, just as it had been designed to be, but then a small fluctuation appeared, barely noticeable at first, a slight deviation in projected movement, 2 miles off course, then 3, and Emily leaned forward, her breath catching just slightly as she expanded the model, recalculating inputs that had been auto-smoothed by the system. That is not possible, she whispered under her breath, but the numbers did not correct themselves. They widened, and the corridor that had been marked safe began to shift into something else entirely, something unstable, something wrong, sir, she said again, this time louder, her voice carrying across the room, you need to see this. A few officers turned, their expressions more curious now than amused, and Cole finally glanced over, irritation flickering across his face as he stepped toward her station. What exactly am I looking at? He asked. But Emily did not answer immediately, she simply mirrored her screen onto the main display, overriding the current projection with her recalculated model, and the room changed, the red zone expanded, bending into the exact path that had been marked clear only moments before, and the silence that followed was different this time, heavier, less certain. It is a recalculation, Emily said, her voice steady despite the tension building in her chest. The system filtered out micro-shifts in wind direction over the last 3 hours, but when you factor them in. She did not finish the sentence, she did not need to, because the result was already visible to everyone. The path was no longer safe, it was exposed, and slowly, almost reluctantly, General Hale stepped forward, his eyes fixed on the screen, not blinking, not reacting, just absorbing, and then, without turning, he spoke, his voice low but carrying across the entire room. Who told you to run that adjustment? Emily hesitated for a fraction of a second, then answered, he did, sir, and for the first time, the general's gaze shifted, not to the map, not to the officers, but to the old man still standing quietly between 2 security personnel, his expression unchanged, as if none of this had surprised him at all. The room did not move, not a chair, not a breath, not even the faint hum of conversation that had filled the space minutes ago, because now every eye was on the old man, and for the first time since he had been dragged in, the weight of that attention felt different, not dismissive, not amused, but uncertain, and General Hale took a single step forward, slow and deliberate, the kind of movement that did not need to be loud to command the room. Release him, he said quietly, and the 2 security officers hesitated only a fraction of a second before letting go, their hands falling away as if they suddenly were not sure they should have touched him at all. Elias Ward adjusted his sleeve slightly, not out of discomfort but habit, his gaze never leaving the map, and Captain Cole let out a short breath, somewhere between disbelief and irritation. Sir, with all due respect, this is getting out of hand, he said, stepping forward again as if trying to reclaim control of something that had already shifted beyond him. We are basing decisions on a maintenance worker who wandered into a restricted briefing, but the general did not respond to him, not immediately. Instead he stopped just a few feet from Elias, studying him, not the uniform, not the age, but the stillness, the kind that did not belong to someone out of place. Where did you see it? The general asked, his voice low, measured, and Elias finally looked away from the screen, meeting his gaze for the first time. It is not on your map, he said, his tone even. It is between the lines you stopped reading, and a faint crease formed on the general's brow, not confusion, but recognition, something old brushing against something older. Explain, the general said, and Elias turned slightly, lifting a hand toward the display, not touching it, just tracing an invisible path through the air. Wind does not move in straight lines out there, he said, it bends around heat, around terrain, around things your system averages out. His finger paused midair, hovering over the exact point where the recalculated path had shifted. 3 hours ago it changed direction, not enough to trigger your filters, but enough to move everything that matters. Emily watched him, her mind racing as his words aligned perfectly with the anomaly she had uncovered, not guesswork, not theory, but something lived, something remembered, and Cole shook his head, though there was less certainty in it now. Even if that were true, that is not something you can just know, he said. But Elias did not look at him. You do not know it, he replied calmly. You recognize it, and for a moment the room felt smaller, tighter, as if the walls themselves were leaning in, and the general exhaled slowly, his eyes narrowing just slightly. How? He asked, and Elias answered without hesitation, without pause, as if the question had been waiting for him long before this room. Because I have seen what happens when you ignore it, he said, and there was no drama in his voice, no emphasis, just a quiet certainty that carried farther than anything louder could have, and something in that answer settled over the room like weight, not fear, not panic, but realization, and General Hale straightened, his posture shifting almost imperceptibly, not into authority, but into something closer to respect. "Update the operation," he said. His voice firm now, leaving no room for interpretation, and the officers moved. Instantly, keyboards clicking, commands relayed, but before anyone could fully process what had just happened, the general added one more sentence, quieter than the first, but heavier, "And no one removes him from this room again," and this time, no one argued. The shift in the room was immediate but not loud, not dramatic in the way people expected change to happen. It was quieter than that, deeper, like something unseen had tilted beneath their feet and everyone could feel it but no one could explain it. Keyboards resumed, commands were issued, but the energy was no longer confident, it was cautious, measured, as if every assumption now carried weight. And Captain Cole stood frozen for a moment longer than the rest, his jaw tightening slightly as he watched officers adjust projections that, minutes ago, had been considered absolute. "Sir," he said finally, his voice controlled but strained at the edges, "we are rewriting an entire operation based on variables that were not previously verified," and General Hale did not turn, his eyes still on the evolving map as new data fed into the system. "They are verified now," he replied, calm, final, and Cole hesitated, searching for footing that was no longer there. "With respect, sir, we are." Trusting him without credentials, without clearance, without any record in the system, and that was the moment something subtle changed again, because Elias Ward did not react to the challenge, did not defend himself, did not even look at Cole, he simply stepped closer to the display, just enough to see the updated model more clearly, as if the conversation happening around him did not require his participation. And Emily noticed it, the way he moved, not cautiously, not uncertainly, but with familiarity, like someone who had stood in rooms like this long before the technology had existed. "Run the elevation overlay," Elias said quietly, not as a suggestion, but as a simple instruction, and Emily blinked, surprised that he spoke directly to her, but her fingers were already moving before she could question it, pulling up another layer of terrain data, the map shifting again, subtle ridgelines appearing, gradients that had been smoothed out in earlier models now standing in sharper relief, and Elias nodded once, almost to himself. "There," he said, pointing to a narrow rise that cut across the projected route, "it channels everything," and Emily leaned closer, her breath slowing as she followed the logic, wind patterns, heat signatures, terrain flow, all converging into a single invisible funnel that the system had averaged into nothing, and now, suddenly, it was everything. "That is why the projection shifted," she said softly, more to herself than anyone else, and this time, no one laughed, no one dismissed it, because the map was no longer arguing back, it was agreeing. And Cole exhaled slowly, the tension in his posture easing just slightly, not into acceptance, but into something closer to uncertainty, and General Hale finally turned, his gaze moving from the display to Elias again, studying him with a different kind of attention now, not authority looking down, but experience looking across. "You have done this before," the general said, not as a question, but as a statement, and Elias met his eyes, his expression unchanged. "A long time ago," he replied, and the words hung there, simple, unadorned, but heavier than anything that had been said so far, and the general held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, as if confirming something only he could see. "Continue," he said, but this time, it was not directed at the room, it was directed at Elias, and that was when the final shift settled into place, because no one in that room needed it explained anymore. The hierarchy had changed, not by rank, not by title, but by something far more difficult to measure, and far harder to ignore. The room no longer questioned him, but it had not yet fully accepted him either. It hovered somewhere in between, suspended in that fragile space where certainty had been replaced by something unfamiliar, and Elias Ward stood at the center of it without claiming it, without acknowledging it, his attention still locked onto the shifting layers of the map as if the room itself had become irrelevant. "The elevation is only part of it," he said, his voice steady, unhurried, and Emily adjusted her stance slightly, her focus tightening as she followed his line of thought, pulling additional data streams into view. "There is something else," she said, almost instinctively now, not questioning him but building on what he had already seen, and Elias gave the smallest nod. Temperature spread, he said, not the average. The pockets, and Emily's fingers moved faster, isolating microclimate readings across the terrain, thin bands of heat variation that the system had flattened into uniformity now rising into view like faint ripples, and suddenly the map did not look clean anymore, it looked complicated, alive, unpredictable, and a murmur passed through the room, not loud, but enough to signal that the shift was being felt by everyone. That changes the air flow, one of the analysts said quietly, almost to himself, and Elias glanced toward the screen again. It changes everything, he replied, and General Hale watched the interaction closely, his expression unreadable but his posture no longer rigid. It had softened, just slightly, into something more attentive, more open. How far does it move them? The general asked, and Emily ran the numbers, recalculating with the new variables layered in, her screen updating in real time. Approximately 5 miles off the original projection, she said, her voice steady but carrying a weight that had not been there before, and a few officers exchanged looks. That was not a minor deviation, that was the difference between precision and failure, between control and exposure, and Captain Cole took a slow breath, his shoulders lowering just a fraction as the reality of the shift settled in, not fully accepting it yet, but no longer able to dismiss it either. We would not have seen that, he said, more quietly now. And Elias did not respond, because there was nothing to add, the map had already said it for him, and Emily leaned back slightly, her eyes still scanning the data. The system filtered it out, she said, it prioritized stability over fluctuation, and Elias nodded once. That is what systems do, he said, they remove what they cannot predict, and the room absorbed that in silence, because it was not criticism, it was fact, and General Hale stepped closer to the display again, his gaze moving across the revised projection, tracing the new path slowly, carefully, as if committing it to memory. And you saw it without any of this, he said, not looking at Elias this time, but the question was still directed at him, and Elias answered just as simply, I have seen the pattern before, and something in the way he said it made the room feel smaller again, not because of tension, but because of perspective, because suddenly the technology, the data, the layers of analysis, all of it felt like an attempt to catch up to something that had already been understood long ago. And General Hale straightened slightly, his decision already made, though he had not spoken it yet. Then we follow your pattern, he said, calm, decisive, and this time, no one hesitated, no one questioned, because the map no longer belonged to the system alone, it belonged to the man who had seen it before it ever appeared on a screen. The command spread through the room with a different kind of urgency now, not rushed, not chaotic, but sharpened, every voice lower, every movement more deliberate, as if the margin for error had suddenly narrowed to something they could all feel but not measure, and Emily watched the updated projection stabilize under the new inputs, the path no longer smooth, no longer idealized, but real, shaped by variables that refused to be simplified, route adjusted, she said, her voice steady as she confirmed the recalibration, and one of the communications officers echoed the update into his headset, relaying the change to units already in motion, and for a moment, no one spoke, because there was nothing left to argue, only to act, and Captain Cole stood a step behind the general now, his earlier confidence replaced by something quieter, something more reflective, his eyes moving between the map and Elias as if trying to reconcile the two. We built the model to eliminate uncertainty, he said finally, not challenging, not defensive, just stating it as he had always believed it, and Elias did not look at him when he answered. You built it to manage it, he said, not to understand it, and Cole exhaled slowly, the words settling deeper than he expected, because they were not an attack, they were an observation, and that made them harder to dismiss, and General Hale folded his arms loosely, his gaze still on the screen. But his attention clearly divided now, part of it tracking the operation, part of it measuring the man standing beside it. You said you have seen this before, the general said, his tone calm but more focused now, when, and Elias paused for the first time, not out of hesitation, but memory, his eyes lowering slightly, not to the floor, but somewhere beyond it, somewhere far removed from the glow of digital displays and climate-controlled air, long before you could see it from space, he said quietly, and the room seemed to lean into that answer, not physically, but in attention, because whatever he was referring to did not belong to their systems, it belonged to something older, something that had not been recorded the way modern operations were, and Emily glanced at him, noticing the shift, subtle but unmistakable, the way his posture did not change but his presence did, as if part of him had stepped into another time entirely, and for a brief moment, the hum of the war room faded in his mind, replaced by something else, something quieter but heavier, the memory of a horizon that did not glow with screens but with heat rising off sand, the absence of data replaced by instinct, by patterns learned through observation rather than calculation, and then it was gone, just as quickly as it had come, and Elias lifted his gaze again, back to the present, back to the map. And General Hale watched him carefully, not pressing further, not needing to, because the answer had already told him what he needed to know. This was not theory, this was not luck, this was experience carved deep enough to outlast time. Status, the general said, shifting his focus back to the operation, and the communications officer responded immediately. Units have adjusted course, sir, new trajectory confirmed, and a quiet breath seemed to move through the room, not relief, not yet, but something close. The kind that comes when the path forward is no longer uncertain, and General Hale gave a single nod, then turned slightly, just enough for his voice to carry to everyone. From this point on, we verify everything twice, he said, once with the system, and once with him, and no one questioned it, no one hesitated, because whatever they had witnessed in the last few minutes had already rewritten more than just the operation, it had rewritten who they trusted to see what others could not. The room settled into a rhythm that felt almost unfamiliar, not because it lacked urgency, but because the urgency had changed shape. It was no longer driven by assumption, but by correction, by the quiet awareness that something critical had nearly been missed, and now every update carried that weight, every adjustment mattered, and Emily kept her eyes locked on the data as it streamed in, her fingers moving with more precision than before, not faster, but sharper, refining rather than reacting. Trajectory holding, she said, her voice steady as new confirmations came through, and the communications officer nodded slightly, relaying updates across channels that no one outside the room would ever hear, and Captain Cole stood still for a moment longer before stepping closer to the display again, not with authority this time, but with intent, his gaze narrowing as he studied the revised map, following the path Elias had traced without touching, and for the first time, he saw it. Not just the data, but the pattern beneath it, the subtle shifts that the system had tried to smooth into predictability, and he let out a slow breath, quieter than before. It was there the whole time, he said, almost to himself, and Elias did not respond, because the statement did not require confirmation, it required understanding, and that was something Cole was only beginning to reach. And General Hale remained at the center of the room, his presence steady, his attention divided between the unfolding operation and the man who had altered it, and after a moment, he spoke again, not to challenge, not to test, but to know. Why did you come in here? He asked, his tone direct but no longer guarded, and Elias shifted his weight slightly, not uncomfortable, just aware, his eyes returning briefly to the mop cart still standing near the doorway, forgotten by everyone except him. Because no one else was going to say it, he replied, simple, without emphasis, and the answer hung in the air longer than expected, not because it was complex, but because it was undeniable, and Emily glanced up at him again, studying him more closely now, not just what he saw, but how he carried it, the absence of urgency, the absence of pride, as if being right had never been the point, only being heard before it was too late. And Cole folded his arms loosely, his posture no longer rigid, his earlier resistance worn down by something quieter, something harder to argue with. You were not even supposed to be in this building, he said, not accusing, just stating the fact as it had been, and Elias gave a small nod, acknowledging it without defense. No, he said, I was not. And there was no apology in it, no justification, just truth, and General Hale watched that exchange carefully, the simplicity of it, the absence of ego, and something about it settled deeper than any report or briefing ever could. And yet you were the only one who saw it, the general said, and Elias met his gaze again, not proud, not humble, just steady. No, he said quietly, I was just the only one who said it out loud, and that was when the room shifted one more time, not in tension, not in urgency, but in understanding, because the difference between seeing and saying suddenly felt larger than anything on the screen, and no one spoke after that, not because there was nothing to say, but because for the first time, they were all thinking the same thing, and it did not need to be spoken. The silence that followed was not empty, it was full, dense with the weight of what had just been understood, and for a few seconds no one moved, no one spoke, because the room had shifted beyond rank and protocol into something quieter, something more human, and General Hale stood still at the center of it, his gaze resting on Elias Ward not as an interruption anymore, but as a presence that had altered the course of everything without asking permission, and slowly, almost imperceptibly, the General straightened his posture, not into authority, but into recognition. "What is your name?" he asked, his voice steady, carrying across the room without force, and Elias met his eyes without hesitation. "Elias Ward," he replied, simple, unembellished, and the name settled into the space like something that had been missing, something that should have been known already but had been overlooked. And General Hale held his gaze for a moment longer, then gave a small nod, as if confirming something only he could see. "Ward," he repeated quietly, and Captain Cole glanced between them, the name registering in a different way now, not as a label, but as a question he had not thought to ask earlier, and Emily's fingers slowed over her keyboard, her attention shifting fully from the map to the exchange unfolding in front of her, because whatever was happening now felt just as important as the operation itself, and General Hale took a single step closer, closing the distance between rank and presence. "You said you have seen this before," he said. "How many times?" And Elias did not look at the screen when he answered. He looked at the general, "Enough to know when it repeats," he said, and there was no pride in it, no emphasis, just a quiet certainty that carried farther than anything louder could have, and the room absorbed that in silence, not because it demanded it, but because it earned it, and the general exhaled slowly, the kind of breath that comes when something finally aligns, when doubt gives way to clarity. And then, without announcement, without ceremony, he did something that no one in the room expected. He stepped back half a pace and raised his hand in a crisp, deliberate salute, not rushed, not symbolic, but exact, precise, directed entirely at the man standing in a janitor's uniform, and the effect was immediate, absolute. The room froze, not out of confusion this time, but out of recognition, because the meaning of that gesture did not need to be explained. And for a brief moment, Elias did not react, not because he did not understand it, but because it did not change anything for him, and then, just as simply, he returned the salute, not higher, not sharper, just equal, and lowered his hand again, and no one spoke, not Cole, not Emily, not a single officer in the room, because the hierarchy they had relied on minutes ago had just been rewritten in a way no system could measure, and General Hale dropped his hand, his voice calm when he spoke again. "From this point forward, Mr. Ward stays," he said, and there was no room for interpretation in it, no need for clarification, and the officers around the room shifted slightly, not in discomfort, but in adjustment, because something fundamental had changed, and as the map continued to update in the background, as data flowed and decisions moved forward, the presence of one man in a worn uniform now carried more weight than all of it combined, and no one questioned it anymore. The room did not erupt into action after the salute, it did not need to, because everything that followed carried a different kind of precision now, quieter, steadier, as if the entire operation had been recalibrated not just on the map, but in the minds of everyone present, and Emily returned to her console, her movements more confident than before, not because the system had improved, but because she understood its limits now, and the data continued to update in real time, confirming the adjusted trajectory, small variations aligning with the pattern Elias had described, and one by one, those confirmations settled into place, not dramatically, not loudly, but undeniably, and the communications officer spoke again, his voice lower than before. "Units are holding the revised course, no deviation reported," and a quiet breath moved through the room, not relief, but acknowledgment. The kind that comes when something difficult has been avoided without anyone outside ever knowing it. Almost happened, and Captain Cole stood still for a moment longer before stepping forward, his posture no longer defensive, no longer rigid, but grounded, and he looked at Elias, not past him, not through him, but directly at him. "I should have listened sooner," he said, the words simple, without decoration, and Elias did not respond immediately, not because he was weighing the apology, but because he did not need it. "You did," he said finally, his tone calm, "before it mattered too late. And Cole gave a small nod, accepting that without argument, because there was nothing left to defend, and General Hale watched the exchange quietly, then turned back to the map one last time, his gaze steady as the final updates locked into place. "Operation stands," he said, his voice clear, carrying authority that no longer needed to prove itself, and the room moved again, but this time it moved together, aligned, each person understanding their role without needing to question it. And after a few seconds, the intensity began to ease, not completely, but enough for the edges of tension to soften, and Elias stepped back slightly, not toward the center, but toward the edge of the room, his place never having been at the front, and Emily noticed it, the way he withdrew without drawing attention. As if his part in the moment had already passed, and she glanced at him, something unspoken in her expression, a quiet respect that did not need to be voiced, and Elias gave the faintest nod in return, then reached for the handle of his mop cart, still waiting where it had been left, and for a moment, no one stopped him, not because they did not see him leaving, but because they understood why he would. And as he moved toward the doorway, General Hale spoke once more, not loud, not commanding. "Just enough to reach him, Mr. Ward," and Elias paused, turning slightly, and the general held his gaze for a brief second before speaking. "We will remember this," and Elias studied him quietly, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "You will," he said, and then he turned back, pushing the cart forward, the soft roll of its wheels fading into the hallway beyond, and inside the war room, the screens continued to glow. The operation continued to move, but something had shifted that would not reset when the systems powered down, something that would remain long after the data was archived, and no one in that room would look at a clean map the same way again, because they had learned, in a moment that no report would ever capture, that not everything important appears on a screen, and not everyone important walks in wearing rank.